Hey YouTube, Twig here, bringing you all an update to my Elementsaber Yugioh deck profile for December 2021. Big thanks to my buddy Nick for letting me borrow his Elementsaber deck for the deck update. This is a very interesting deck. It definitely, I would say, is one of the overlooked Yu-Gi-Oh decks, one that was a focus for changing the different attributes of all the different Elementsabers in the graveyard to then work with the different elemental lords we had in Yu-Gi-Oh at the time, being able to special summon out those element lords, then also gain additional benefits from having specific attributes in your graveyard for all the different Elementsabers on the field, and really working around their one field spell for more special summoning power for the Elementsabers as well. I'm definitely happy with the results of the deck. Like I said, I definitely do feel this deck could use some more support in the future to really make it one of the more well-known decks out there with the support it already has. But until then, let's go ahead and get started with the deck profile. So for the Elementsaber monsters, we are running 3 Elementsaber Malehu. I wanted to focus more on the pure Elementsaber deck. I know that maybe there's a potential for the invoked monsters to work with this deck, having the option for all the different attributes that you can make in your graveyard. That's for a future video if I were to mix those two decks. But with Elementsaber Malehu, once per turn, quick effect, you can send 1 Elementsaber monster from your hand to the graveyard to target 1 face-up monster on the field, change it to face-down defense position, and once per turn, if this card's in the graveyard, you can declare 1 attribute in this card in the graveyard, and it becomes that attribute. This is a card effect that is shared by the good majority of the different Elementsaber monsters, but with Malehu, you can basically disrupt your opponent's plays if they were to try and go for a Link, Synchro, or Xyz play by just sending that Elementsaber monster from your hand to the graveyard, then flipping their monster face down, disrupting any of those plays aside from fusion, making sure that they can't have the play needed for them to summon out their monster also. It's a quick effect, so you can use it whenever, and it's just good to have this card as one of your go-to setup cards on the field to begin with. The next one we run for more disruption is also Elementsaber La Pualia. This one, once per turn, when a spell or trap is activated, quick effect, you can send 1 Elementsaber monster from your hand to the graveyard, negate the activation, and if you do destroy it once per turn, if this card is in the graveyard, you can declare 1 attribute. This card in the graveyard becomes that attribute, sharing the same option of being able to stop spell and traps by sending Elementsabers. The biggest thing with this deck will obviously be the cost of just being able to have all of these different Elementsabers to use for these different monsters, but being able to set them up in the graveyard can also help for some of the other plays which we rely on. And another one of the 3 ofs that I run in the deck is Elementsaber Ina. With this one, once per turn, you can send 1 Elementsaber monster from your hand to the graveyard, then target 1 Elementsaber monster except for Ina, or Elemental Lord monster that has been properly summoned in your graveyard, and special summoning it, ignoring its summoning conditions. Once per turn, if this card's in the graveyard, being able to declare an attribute, and it becomes that attribute. So the Element Lord monster is also just an added bonus for our Element Lord monster we run, which is Phosphorage. We'll get to the Element Lords in just a bit for this deck, but that special summon definitely does come in handy for the added options for the special summon of a bigger monster on the field. For that special summon, also just being able to ignore the summoning conditions, but still have the benefits of the special summoned Elemental Lord on the field. I would say this is definitely a 3 of, just because you have those resources to get you more and more different Elementsabers on the field for you to use. I also, for one of our bigger boss monsters, run 3 Elementsaber La Pualia Mana. I would say this is this monster after being exposed to the magic power of mana. This one, you can send 2 other monsters from your hand to the graveyard, special summon this card from your hand. You can only use this effect of Elementsaber La Pualia Mana once per turn. Apply the following effects of Elementsaber and Elemental Lord monsters you control, depending on the following effects of Saber monsters in the graveyard used to activate this card's effect. So once again, all these added options for your Elementsabers depending on the original attributes. If it's earth or wind, they cannot be destroyed by battle. Water or fire cannot be destroyed by effects. If it's light or dark, your opponent cannot target it with card effects. So a great boss monster to rely on, and also one to easily make use of for your additional search of your Palace of the Elemental Lords, which we'll get to when we go over the spell cards. But a definite 3 of for some of the lower numbers for the Elementsaber monsters. I run 2 Elementsaber Makani. Once per turn, you can send 1 Elementsaber monster from your hand to the graveyard to add 1 Elementsaber or Elemental Lord monster from your deck to your hand, except for Elementsaber Makani. And once per turn, if this card's in the graveyard, being able to change its attribute. It's more of a search and setup type of card. It's not as viable, I would say, as some of your more protection cards, but it can help with some of these search plays. You want to rely more on these cards for their shutdown of your opponent's plays and Ina for more of the special summon, but Makaine basically being able to search out specific cards you may need definitely does come in handy, but more of a dead draw if you already have your setup ready to go. I also run one Elementsaber Nalu and one Elementsaber Malo, with Malo once per turn being able to send one Elementsaber monster from your hand to the graveyard to send one Elementsaber or Elemental Lord monster from your deck to the graveyard. Can set up an Elemental Lord, which you can then special summon back thanks to cards like Ina, which is a big plus there. Just remember that Elemental Lord monster has to be properly summoned first beforehand. And with Nalu once per turn being able to send one Elementsaber monster from your hand to the graveyard to target one in your graveyard and add it to your hand. So you can set up with Malo and then add it back to your hand with Nalu, being more of a quicker search play to use using both of these cards. And I also run them for the fire and water additional tribute options to use with some of our other Elementsabers, including La Polio Mana having the different attribute benefits for water and fire, being that it cannot be destroyed by card effects. And for the Elemental Lord monsters, I run one Phosphorage Elemental Lord and one Moulin Glacia. Moulin Glacia is more for the discard power against your opponent. And with Phosphorage, when special summon, you can destroy monsters your opponent controls, all of them. And you can only use this effect of Phosphorage once per turn. Being able to destroy all of them, disrupting them with this easy setup. And the reason I run both these Elemental Lords, they're, I definitely would say, some of the best ones to use in the deck. But you can change the attributes of your Elementsabers in the graveyard, meaning that if you have a bunch of different monsters in your graveyard, you can change their attributes, adjusting so you have the exactly 5 needed, whether it be for light or water, to special summon this card, or either one out from your hand to the field. And then after being properly summoned, you can summon them back onto the field using Elementsaber Ina, but still gain their special summoned effects for those cards. For the rest of the monsters in the main deck, I just run 3 Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring as more of an added option for stopping your opponent's search or send power for their graveyard. You don't really use them much else for the deck since we don't really rely on synchros or anything else in the X deck, but still great to rely on for the different attributes you may use for some of your Elementsabers. And that is it for the main deck monsters. We'll now move on to the spells. I run 3 Palace of the Elemental Lords, probably one of the most important spell cards in the deck. All monsters you control gain attack and defense equal to the number of different attributes in your graveyard times 200. Once per turn, you can add one Elementsaber monster from your deck to your hand, but skip the battle phase of your next turn, even if this card leaves the field. Once per turn, if an Elementsaber monster in your hand or field would send cards from their hand to the graveyard to activate an effect, you can send that many Elementsaber monsters from your deck to the graveyard instead. So you need this card set up on the field to make sure you don't resort to minusing yourself with your Elementsabers in your hand. If you have Palace of the Elemental Lords and Mulehu on the field, you can then just send the monster from your deck to the graveyard instead of your hand, making sure you don't minus yourself for still being able to shut down either one of your opponent's plays. Or if you have your Lapailu, you have all these different options available to you with Palace of the Elemental Lords and more of that search power. You do skip the battle phase of your next turn, but well worth it, especially if you make use of your Element Lords, because they also make you skip the battle phase when they leave the field the following next turn. I also run the 1 Terraforming to search out this very important field spell for the deck, so pretty much needed for sure to make sure you get the proper cards to your hand to add. And for more draw power in the deck, I am running 3 Pot of Extravagance. I wasn't going for the Invoked engine, so decided to focus more on this, sort of draw power in the deck. At the start of your main phase, banish 3 or 6 random face-down cards from your extra deck, and face down, you draw 1 for every one of the 3 cards banished. So you draw 2 if you banish 6, and for the rest of this turn, after this card resolves, you cannot draw any cards by card effects, but you have Palace of the Elemental Lords to search from your deck to your hand, so you can get around that with this card. And very, very useful because you don't really make use of any of your extra deck in this deck. It's mostly there just as added options to go into, but the main plays come down to the different Elementsaber and Elemental Lords you run in the main deck. For more additional draw power, running multiples of plenty of cards, 2 Pot of Desires. The draw power can definitely, never be enough with the 3 Extravagance and 3 Desires. You're just going to go through a lot of different cards if you don't have Palace of the Elemental Lords for all the minuses of your Elementsabers on the field. So having as much draw power as you can use definitely will come in handy. For the last of the spells, just 1 Reinforcements of the Army. This card is a searcher for the good majority of all the different Elementsabers we run in the deck, being able to add either one to your hand and then make use of it depending on the play you need. For the trap cards, now moving on to the traps, I run 2 Elemental Training. Your opponent cannot target Palace of the Elemental Lords you control with card effects. Also cannot be destroyed by card effects. Once per turn, you contribute 1 monster to special summon 1 Elementsaber monster from your deck with a different original tribute than that monster's. And you can send this face-up card from the field to the graveyard to discard your entire hand, then add 1 Elemental Lord monster from your graveyard to your hand equal to the number of cards discarded. The Elemental Lord search can come in handy, especially if you want to reuse either or for their specific plays, but also being able to just have your main go-to search power and power up card field spell be protected using this card is definitely needed. So if these are both on the field and your opponent were to, basically nuke the field, you can at least save the field spell, sending this card instead, and then having it remain on the field to have and search and set up all your different Elementsaber plays. I also run 3 Rivalry of Warlords. This card, each player can only control 1 type of monster. Once again, you don't make much use of the extra deck. Your main plays come down to the different warrior monsters, which you'll control. If you don't control those warriors, then you'll be relying on your Elemental Lords. But you can play around that and this card for that setup. I also thought of Summon Limit, but I like more of the shutdown for the warrior plays because there's not going to be a lot of people playing specifically warriors, and it'll be definitely difficult for them to get around this warrior lock. And I also run 3 Infinite Impermanence for more of the effect negation of my opponent's cards on the field, especially if they go first, and I can rely on this. And it's also an easier card to have now with the reprint from the Cyber Strike structure deck. And lastly, the 1 Metaverse to search out the Palace of the Elemental Lords and add to our hand or activate it on the field. And that is it for the main deck. We'll now move on to the extra deck. Like I said, the extra deck is pretty generic. There's nothing specific for the Elementsaber monsters. So 1 Nightmare Phoenix, 1 Barricade Board Blocker, 1 Underclock Taker, 1 Panastag, 1 Isolde, 1 Nightmare Unicorn, 1 Blackluster Soldier, Soldier of Chaos, 1 Decode Talker, 1 Saryuja, and 1 Borreload Dragon for the Link monsters. For the Xyz monsters, 1 Tornado Dragon, 1 Daigusto Morale, 1 Baguska, 1 Daigusto Phoenix, and 1 Divine Arsenal Sky Thunder for the added option when your Xyz monsters do battle against your opponent. As for the go-to plays, locking down your opponent will be a big part of it. So if you can set up your Palace and your Elementsaber of choice, it'll all come down to just being able to adjust the different attributes in your graveyard to match with the different Elementsaber you may have on the field at the time, and then play around your opponent's plays, being able to swing over their face-down monsters or just stop their own spell and traps long enough for you to then set up your bigger boss monsters with your Elementsaber setup in the graveyard. But that is it for the deck profile. I hope you all enjoyed. This is definitely an overlooked deck, but definitely one to consider playing if you're looking for something more budget, but definitely a lot more fun to use. And as always, until next time, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And Kira, Twig out.